Welcome to the Southbound Podcast. I am Patrick Reed, co-hosting today with Kyle Snipes.
Yeah, and today we're really excited to have Nancy Whitworth, former Economic Development Director for the City of Greenville and current Economic Development Consultant for One Spartanburg Inc. Nancy obviously doing some amazing things over there and have done some amazing things in the life of Greenville over the past, 40 years even. But today, having a great conversation, or would love to have a great conversation with you about kind of who you are, where you've been, and what you've seen over that time. Hey, love to dive right in. Can we talk to you a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and kind of how you rose through the ranks?
Sure. Well, great to be with you today. And I am from a small town in South Carolina, Calhoun Falls in Abbeville County. Mm-hmm. I grew up on a farm. And my father grew up on a farm. So he felt like, everybody has to have a farm. Yep. And so it was wonderful as a child growing up. Very focused on church and family and hard work and really community. And so that's sort of where I got my roots in really sort of understanding the real importance, first off, of hard work, but also the importance of establishing really good foundations. I grew up there, and I have to admit that it was fun as a child. It was fun playing on a farm. Right. My father also had the local hardware store, so that always came in handy. Right. But I think as I grew older, and it was a small town, in my teen years, I this is not exactly my kind of place. And I remember being very critical. Now, I was a bit rebellious. And now I think people think of me as very much a rule follower, and I am to a great extent. Yeah. But at that point in my life, I was a little bit rebellious, and my attitude was not always the best that it could be. Right. And I do remember my mother telling me, she said, when you are critical of a place where you live and you're critical of your community, you realize you're being critical of yourself as well. And so you have an obligation. Sure. Now, I didn't appreciate that answer quite so much at that point in time. Later, I did. It's those things that I think as you go through life, all of those things along the way, I think help mold you into what you are. And they're always wonderful life lessons, even if you don't listen to them as much at the time. They always come back to you. So I grew up there, and I had an older brother and a younger brother who were both much smarter than me, who I
find that hard to believe.
Who I adore. But kind of being the middle child, I had to work a little bit harder because my younger brother was a good bit younger, and then my older brother was just a year older. So when it was time for me to leave, I was really ready to leave. And my brother was at Clemson, and I think the idea was that's where I would go. Well, I decided I would do something different. I went to Winthrop for a year. Okay. Well, I went to Winthrop, and after about 2 weeks, I realized I had made a mistake. And I remember calling my mother, and I was like, this isn't working. And I think I need to transfer. And she said, okay, you can do that, but you need to complete the year before you do that. Okay. So not exactly what you want to hear when you're ready to.
2 weeks into your first year.
And knowing, and she said, but you made the decision. Right. And I think she was thinking in her mind, I don't think I would have, we didn't know exactly why you were doing, but anyway, be that as it may. She said, you made the decision. You have to own the decision, and you can correct it, but you need to commit. You need to make that commitment. Right. And again, it was another one of those little life lessons that things don't always, you do make mistakes, and they can be correctable, but you also have to be accountable for those, accountable for your actions. So I ended up at Clemson, loved it there. Sure. I did both undergraduate and graduate degrees there, and so all worked out. So that's how I...
What did you major in grad school? Or what was your focus
in grad school? Interesting It was agricultural and applied economics. Now, I think today it's just applied economics. So at the time, it was really rural sociology. And I ended up there. I was going into counseling, but I ended up there because I ended up working for that department. Wow. And I found out, what they were doing was just really interesting. So it was more about natural resource, economics and human resource economics. And so really very similar kind of to a planning background. So very similar to that.
Before they called it city planning, and maybe this was
well, I think there was city planning at the time, but I can't remember. That's been so long ago. But a lot of the fundamentals. But the thing I liked, it was applied. So you had to know the theory. But it was very much applied, and you could apply it to anything.
Okay. So after grad school, you finished up at Clemson. Where did you go after that?
Okay, so after I graduated, the plan that my professors, who were wonderful, they felt like I needed to go on and get a PhD. And I was like, I really wasn't sure that academics was where I needed to be. And so I ended up, my first job was with Greenville County in grants, oddly enough. Oh, wow. But I was coming at a time when there weren't a whole lot of jobs. So there are different points in time where, the economy is a little bit different than at others. And so that was the time. So I was there. But while I was there, the City of Greenville set up an economic development department. So it was a new initiative for them. And so I began talking with the person that they had brought in as the director during that year. And so I completed my year. And then I moved over and was part of the economic development team as it was initially being developed at the city.
Around what time was that? When was
that was in 79.
Wow.
Can I ask too, so speaking of, so in 79, the beginning of the City of Greenville's Economic Development Department, how many other cities or municipalities were doing that? Do you know?
I don't know. I think in some way, a lot of larger cities were always sort of have been in economic development. I think the interesting thing about economic development is it can take so many different directions. I think some people think of the traditional economic development as the job creating, which is an important aspect, or the recruiting industry and that part of it. The other part is really the development part. And at the time, the city didn't have a separate planning department. I think the county was doing the planning. I think the city had zoning, but not, true planning. And so it really offered, and because it was new, it was kind of like, it was a whole lot of different things all melded together. And there were very few of us. So there was the director, and there was me, there was another person, and an intern. And the interesting thing is that we had one office. So they weren't quite ready for economic development at that point in time. That was the message I got. So, but it was fine because we spent a lot of time, obviously, outside of that one little office that was smaller than any other office I'd ever had in my entire life. We just kind of rotated. But we spent a lot of time on which you really, if you're going to be in economic and community development, you really need to have your boots on the ground. So it was a lot of time spent outside.
Right.
Well, during that phase too, and I think for everybody as they're coming out of school trying to get that first job going, naturally come out wide-eyed, bushy-tailed, ready to go. But also too, it helps having some people that'll pour into you and help kind of steer you and guide you. Did you have anybody that helped sort of get your feet up underneath you and to begin moving forward?
Sure. That's the. I think as really as the whole economic development really sort of evolved. There were, particularly as I moved more into sort of the development side of the house, there were, there were some older and I don't like to give names, but I probably should give one. It was Frank Halter. And Frank was he was very gracious. Now, remember, I was young, and women, you really, economic development, there really were not that many women in economic development. It was just kind of like, what do you know? But I do remember Frank Halter kind of taking me under his wing, and he became, he really validated, I think, what I was doing, because he would call, and most people would call me Nance. I could always tell when you developed a relationship, and he would say, Nance, I'm meeting with someone, really need, I told them they need to meet with you. And then throughout the years, whenever, as things do, if you're in the development, everybody's not happy all the time. So whether it's the contractors or the engineers, and from a city standpoint, we're regulatory too.
Sure.
And so sometimes we'd get a little out of kilter. And it was usually Frank who would call and say, "Okay, Nance, we've got to get everybody together. It looks as though we're kind of," and it was learning that too, is that you can have conflict. And it's how you deal with that conflict. And a way to do that is to be open and honest with each other, and sit down and figure out, what are you experiencing, and, and also understand from the standpoint of, a city, we do have regulations we have to follow too.
Yeah, of course. But
we can always make those work.
Yeah.
So he was very helpful in that
Nancy,
regard.
when you started as economic development in 1979. What did Greenville look like back then, kind of going into the 80s? And then, we had a pretty beginning of the boom in the late 90s and the 2000s. So just kind of maybe paint us a little bit of a picture, take us on a walk through kind of the progression of Greenville in your 40 years at economic development. Okay,
so when I came to the city, the Hyatt was under construction because that was a long construction period. The streets were underway because most people don't remember, Main Street was 4 lanes of moving traffic, parallel parking, and there was not a tree in sight. So I think up and down there may have been some potted trees here and there. You know what? And when it was active, when the department stores, when the people were there, you really didn't notice it as much. It's when everything started to move out that you really noticed just kind of how barren it was. And so when I came, that work had begun. So that was, to me, that was really between the redoing the street. And that was important. And the story there, I think that has been relayed. We had a group of businessmen who really, really cared about the community. I mean, the names are, the Buck Mickle, the Tommy White. I mean, it can go on and on. But they saw a vision and were willing to, and along with Max Heller, they were willing to do something. Now, I will say, just making a place look pretty or making a street look pretty doesn't necessarily make things happen. And so in conjunction with that, it was the Hyatt, which was really the first really big public-private partnership. And in fact, at the time, and I wasn't involved in putting, that predated me, believe there are things that predated me, even at my age. But it was really one of the first in the country, really, to do something because, the way it was structured with a convention center and a hotel, and the atrium was actually considered a public park because you had to figure out how for the city to own certain things and how the private sector.
How the public benefits from it.
And so the initial was, the public, the atrium of the Hyatt was really public property, except where the bar was located and where the registration desk. And so that
it's still like that, though.
And it's just really open. But the whole, and the plaza's really privately owned, but it acts like public space. And I think that's really important. So it was really that. And I think the hotel was something that, because I think there really wasn't, at this point in time, the Poinsett Hotel, is
all the way down.
really in dire straits.
That's right.
And so it was really, that's going to be something that would stimulate office development. And it actually did, because not long after that, the towers, Liberty now, but at the time, those were developed.
That's right.
And so it really sparked.
Yeah.
And it was really kind of that really first anchor.
Well, did you guys too see that with when the height was being planned? And I know you came in while it was being constructed, but I guess that original vision did I guess the forefathers, for lack of a better term, right? Did they see, hey, this may be kicking off some additional office development in Greenville? It could lead to A, B, and C.
Yeah, and no, really, I think that was the whole intent.
Right.
And they were right. Because remember, when you look back, Greenville was very, very strong in terms of its business development. It really was. It was doing well. Even with the textile industry beginning to wane, other companies came in.
Right.
And so it was in that transition. But to bring in, and of course, Daniel, construction was still underway at the time.
That's right.
And it was, we need to be able to bring, because it was like bringing visitors into, particularly corporate visitors, into the market and really establishing a place.
Yeah. Right.
And so it did, it really accomplished what it set out to do.
Right.
Hey, Nancy, tell us a little bit more about Greenville creating a blueprint per se with this public-private partnership projects throughout. You have the Peace Center, Falls Park. How did some of those kind of come to be? How were they able to be pieced together?
Okay. Well, just about if you could go up and down Main Street, beyond, even outside, throughout our neighborhoods, pretty much everything has been done in a public-private partnership. And I think that really, again, becomes really one of the key ingredients for Greenville's success. I think is that. So I think with the Hyatt, there was this real deliberate. Well, there was a plan, of course. There was a plan, but it's really looking at what are those strategic investments that can be made that, first and foremost, will kind of help stimulate business, which at the end of the day, that is important. But it was with the thought of what can we do for the people who are here too. And so I think with the Peace Center, and again, it was a gift. The initial gift was, from a family,
right?
The Peace family. And that was more a philanthropic and public partnership.
Right.
That the businesses were totally involved in too. And so it was really that, and it was, when you think about it, at the time that the Peace Center was done, there really was not much going on. No. We used to refer to Washington Street as sort of the demarcation line.
Which is wild to think about.
It's hard to believe, but when you ventured there, and you think about, going, but it was also, it was the river. And what city would, that has a river, doesn't really embrace the river?
Right.
Now, I grew up on a farm, and so, the Reedy is what my father would call a creek or a branch.
Yeah, of course.
But you know what? But it is a body of water.
That's right.
And it was embracing what you have. Now, it took us a while, but even with the Peace Center, I think it brought people to Greenville. But more importantly, it really reinforced the arts.
Yes.
And the importance of art in this community. And that's good for business too.
It is.
And so when you can do things that can do multiple And I think that's the important thing, is looking at those things that can stimulate multiple things to happen.
Right.
I think are always going to be. And then it was with, again, credit to Tommy White, who, through his leadership, acquired all of the property on the other side of the Peace Center long before. And it was just a couple of warehouses and it really, but the important thing is there was a vision for that. And I know there were many times when developers would want to do something. And it was like, that just is not. And so, again, I think it gets back to having that patience and that commitment. We need to do it right. That's and so to wait, because sometimes there's always that that desire for that instant gratification, and sometimes it takes a while for good things to happen.
So, and I'd love to follow up on that too, just with, and I know we're going to talk about some more projects, but right now we're talking a little bit about the Hyatt and the Peace Center, and then what kind of became beside the Peace Center with the Weiss accumulation of land there. Without a doubt, there's people that push back on probably all of those developments, even the streetscape going back that far, and then people that embrace it. I know the city had to be a little bit in the middle to navigate those waters. So, especially with the naysayers, how did you guys navigate those waters to get these things built?
Well, you're always going to have naysayers. And I think it always helps if you got a plan, so that, you've got a vision and you've got a plan that people have bought into. That sort of helps. That helps in that regard. But I do think that's where and again, I give kudos to elected officials who they're the ones who take the brunt of any criticism.
Sure.
I mean, they always will. But with a vision and with partners, it really, the partners help provide some of the girding, I think, sometimes for the public sector. So when you've got those aligned, and you've got a clear vision that you've all, I think that's what makes the difference. And again, it evolves over time. So there has to be trust established that, we're sort of all in this together, and we know what the end result. And it's not always going to be pleasant getting there. And I think that's where, if there are ever times that conflicts arise, sometimes it's not what the outcome is. It's how you get there. And sometimes it takes taking a lot of time to listen to people and, be able to sit there, and you have to have a tough skin to be able to sit there and take a lot of that and understand and really try to appreciate where people are coming from. And see if there are ways that you can help navigate some of those issues, so that, because what you're searching for is for, you never get perfection, don't get me wrong. So, but what you're searching for is to try to figure out how to make the most people comfortable with what you're doing, or accepting of what you're doing, or, feeling as though, I think this is going to be okay. Even if I don't love it, I think it's going to be okay.
So, Nancy, one thing I'd love to ask you is, getting to know you and appreciating your role for the past 40 years at the City of Greenville, and now working with Spartanburg Inc. I try to kind of come up with a character title for you in Greenville's story, and I kind of come up with the unsung hero. How do you feel about that as the title for the City of Greenville story?
No, I don't think I see myself as a hero, for one thing. What I see myself is someone who, first and foremost, I loved what I did. I still do. It's just my husband, a accuses me of just working for entertainment, which is, which is probably true. But I loved what I did.
Right.
And the thing that I loved about what I did, particularly with the city, was the ability, because I grew up there. My entire professional career, most people, that's unheard of.
Oh, yeah.
And
40 years?
And when I look back, but for me, it was Greenville was, throughout that entire time I was there, it was changing. I mean, like every 5 or 6 years, it was really like a new city. And it was always, okay, kind of like, all right, this, but, you could see down, you could begin to see, that path of, oh, wow, so if we do this and we get this. And the other was, and I really feel strongly about economic development, is really community development too. And it's working within the neighborhoods as well. And very few people have the ability. I think you're usually sort of cast in a certain in a box.
Yeah.
I was never really in a box throughout most of my career. So it was, moving outside that box all the time and expanding that box and sometimes getting jerked back into the box. But it allowed some creativity, some risk taking.
Yeah. So early on, you're talking to public officials, you're talking to private developers, you're talking to community leaders, and you have a relationship with all these people, all kind of communicating with them at the same level, trying to get everyone to balance and understand each other so that the project can go through and that everyone feels like they benefit from the end of it. I appreciate that so much. That's amazing.
And I guess one of the things that, there were many things that I couldn't control.
Right.
And I know for a lot of people, that's a hard thing. Everybody wants to be in control. Well, when you're in a dynamic environment like economic development within, a public environment to boot, you're not in control. So you have to learn how to navigate through that.
Sure.
And I think if I could define something I did, it was probably more trying to influence. Rather than trying to, I always said, and a great development buddy of mine would always, we joked about this, there can only usually be one ego in a room at a time.
Right.
And it was never going to be mine. It was never going to be mine. But it allowed me to really, I think, sometimes have more influence than I would have if I were the actual decision maker sitting there.
Right.
Because I had the ability to, sort of, I tried to listen more than I talked.
Right.
And sometimes it is that sometimes people underestimate. I think my personality is I'm assertive, but I'm not real aggressive. Unless I have to be.
Sure.
But I think sometimes people underestimate if somebody's just, particularly in the development world, if you're just not out there, but that can be an advantage. And I think that's something that I found sometimes is an advantage because it's always better to underpromise and overdeliver. And so it was, sometimes it was that, wow, particularly when I was younger.
Sure.
Yeah.
She does seem to know, she does seem to know a little bit about what she's doing here. So it's always better. I always thought it was better for someone to come to that conclusion on their own rather than try to convince somebody.
Nancy, you're such a classy person. You know how to take a room and really kind of know, who's kind of calling the shots, listen to it, absorb, and gain both sides and listen for everyone. I think that's a pretty, unteachable ability that you have. And I think it's...
I don't know whether it's unteachable. I think, as I look back again, I relayed some. There's always that voice, and a lot of times it is, your parents. But it was for me, it was my mother. Always telling me, there's certain things you cannot control, but you can always control your attitude and your behavior. Now, I had to work on my behavior a lot being younger, but I think it is a teachable. If you really,
that's great.
Some people it comes easier with than others, but I do think it's an important part. And I think as the world is changing. This isn't. And I saw it change just in my career.
Oh, sure.
So you guys know, I worked with people who were my parents' age, my contemporaries, people my children's age, and younger. So it's quite of a span of people.
Right.
And so you have to adjust because everybody does things differently. And so I do think you have to be. Now, I have to admit, my undergraduate degree was in psychology and sociology.
That's a good
And
thing.
so there were times when I thought that's what I was going to do. But honestly, I probably used those skills as much, if not more. You need to understand, particularly like in economics, you need to understand how to do things. But if you don't understand how to read people, understand people, and work with people, there's not much you can do.
That's right. That's brilliant.
In fact, I was doing something for a group the other a couple of weeks ago. It was for a group in Western Virginia, and they gave me a title. Most people don't ever give you a title.
Right.
Okay, here's what we want you to talk about is thinking strategically, but acting tactfully. And I thought, but then the more I thought about it, as we talked, it was like, that we are taught how to be strategic, and everybody intuitively knows that.
Right.
But thinking about tactfully, to try to figure out how to influence an outcome or others, and there's not much you do.
Right.
That you're not dealing with a difficult issue, or you're dealing with people, and understanding how to do that in a tactful way.
That's amazing.
So I have to jump in and ask you. So because of all the egos that you had in the room, working through the years that you have with economic development, but then just in every situation, you mentioned a diverse group of folks that you're working with in a diverse age group. So creating that influence, thinking strategically but acting tactfully. From a very practical standpoint, when you walked into a room and you knew that you had to think strategically and cast a vision, were there any things that you were thinking about on how you were going to do that?
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know that I ever thought about that. I think it was more really being able to articulate sort of
very important
where you need to go. But I think the most important thing is always helping people arrive to that on their own.
Sure.
And that's different for different people.
Sure.
And it's, whatever group that you're dealing with. I think the main thing is to always articulate too that, it's going to take time. There are certain things that we can and we may not be able to do. And that when you're very clear with people about what the potential outcomes could be. I think it's also important in a lot of things, and depending on what the project was, is to, there are always unintended consequences of whatever we do. and particularly in city development. There are a lot of things that you do, and it seems like the right thing to be doing at that point in time.
That's right.
There are always going to be some unintended consequences. And so it's really kind of, and I always try to surround myself with very bright, smart people. And
it helps.
And it does help. And have that to have. So again, it's never about you. It's being able to bring others and listen to them because you can learn so much that way.
Sure.
And I think the other thing is, and as we talk about, because a lot of, I think when people see my role, they are thinking sort of, from the developer standpoint, from the business standpoint. But it's also the neighborhoods too. And it's the and being able to see. I grew up in a rural a rural part of South Carolina. I grew up. You got to realize I was born in the 50s, and of course it was a very segregated. But the thing that my parents were like, makes no difference, but we went through that. And so understanding where people are coming from, I think is really important. So I felt as comfortable, earlier on, I was, there probably was not a street in Greenville that I was not on, whether it was obtaining right-of-ways for all of our engineering projects. But it's understanding how you need to deal with people at whatever level they are, and treating people with respect and kindness. People will remember that.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's like you can tell people no, but it's how you tell them. They won't remember so much the no if it's delivered in the right way, but they sure will if it's not. So that was another.
I would love to, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I kind of do, because I would love to hear how you deliver a no, or an example of how you deliver a no, so that people don't walk away frustrated or angry. And I know that's not always possible.
Well, first off, I think your natural inclination is always, let's just get it over with. It's just okay. But I think it really, again, it always helps if you've established the relationship and the trust first.
Right.
That's not always possible. But I think it's to really sit down and listen and I understand. Basically, I think it's just that. I understand what you want to do.
That's
I
right.
understand where you're coming from. And I respect that. But, here is another side of the coin, or, if it's particularly if it's something that is a requirement. Now, we can, and we did in economic development. We weren't always the most popular people within some other departments, but our role was really to facilitate, to really try to kind of be that. It's not that we were always trying to take the side of the private developer or whatever. But it was really trying to find a balance. And so I think when you at least acknowledge to people, look, we've looked at this, we've tried to figure out, but you know what? We can't do it, but here's why we can't do it. But now here's what we could do. We could do this. And so I think, but that takes tact, but it takes time.
Sure.
It really takes some time to sit down with people and try to talk through it.
Right.
Yeah.
And let people know you're really trying, and you are. But there's always going to be a line you can't go, you can't cross.
Sure.
So that, I think it's.
Well, Nancy Whitworth, the original Greenville influencer facilitator. We're going to take a quick break and come right back.
All right, so everybody, we're back with Southbound Podcast with our guest, Nancy Whitworth. And so Nancy, we've been talking a little bit about just your past and the development of you throughout the years and also to the development of City of Greenville, from, the early 1980s through today. So wanted to ask you about a couple of other projects that were pretty pivotal in making Greenville into what it is. That being the West End and the ball field there, and then also to Falls Park. And without a doubt, there's always people who want to say, hey, we were on board from the beginning. We knew this was going to be fantastic. But in real life, oftentimes, there's plenty of people who are against that or against any kind of change. So love for you to share with us how you navigated those waters of, uncertainty.
And you're right. You're right, Kyle. There are always going to be naysayers, but what you always hope is that you can convert those naysayers after something happens into be, and forgetting that they were actually naysayers. And I think that the Falls Park was certainly a pivotal. And I have to put in River Place with that too, because that really was very transformational. And actually, River Place, I think, began just a little bit before Falls Park, but it was all right in that same time frame. And what city has a waterfall that you cover, but it had always been that way. And so again, I credit the mayor and council of we're going to take that bridge down. And there were people who said, why would you take down a perfectly good bridge?
Sure.
And that, but it really didn't take that much traffic anyway.
Right.
And so there were those who felt like, that's probably not a good thing to do. Okay. But as it turned out, it's just been probably one of the most transformational things that's happened. And I think working alongside that was the River Place project. That land had been assembled, ready for the right development, and that was very controversial.
Okay.
There was land that had to be acquired for the public spaces. There was condemnation, which cities do not take that very lightly when they have to go out and condemn property, especially when there are people involved. And so that was very controversial at the time. But again, I think it was having the vision of what it could be. And people couldn't quite see that. And I think now, as you look at South Main, I don't think you could ever envision that there were buildings that were sitting right where the public is so engaged. So that, but again, I think it is when the public and the private sector can work together and have that vision, and they support. Provide that support. That one was one I think that kind of helped. We had began to start some things in the West End, but I think really establishing that beachhead of the park, along with a wonderfully done mixed-use development. Opening up the river was really pretty superb. That really allowed, again, movement on down into the West End. We kind of started with the West End Market, and that was something that the city had taken on, and that was probably one of the most critical points in my professional life, having to be the developer of a mixed-use development and take on the financing, the development, the leasing, and the management of it was and aspects of it failed miserably. A farmer's market that we couldn't get farmers to. I mean, but it's understanding that you can make mistakes, and let's figure out, Plan A didn't work, so let's move on to Plan B. And getting that stabilized, and then, of course, the baseball stadium. Not everybody liked the idea of a baseball stadium.
So I got to ask you, too, the objections that you guys heard around the baseball stadium. Can you share kind of what were the big...
Well, I think initially it was, now if we had a baseball stadium, obviously it was the Brave Stadium out on the outskirts of the city. Very dated. And it was I think there were a lot of people who felt like, well, it needs to be in kind of in an open space where people can get to it.
Right.
And I think the city, we were very adamant about if we're going to do a baseball stadium, it needs to be within the context of a mixed use development.
Right.
And that was really important because baseball stadiums aren't used every day. But you fast forward and you look at how a baseball stadium is used today.
Wow.
It is, I mean, it's, it's 365 days a year.
Yeah.
So there was some pushback kind of from that. But then I think once people understood the vision, I think the other, if you are a baseball purist, there was that concern that, okay, we're going from a AA to an A, whatever. But, baseball, it is a sport, but it also is an entertainment as well. And so understanding that and I think the drive really gets that, it's not, it is about baseball, but it's also about an opportunity for people to gather.
That's right.
And it's that gathering element. It's creating those opportunities for people that are most important. Right. And then there was the concern about what impact would it have on the neighborhood.
Yep.
And again, valid, absolutely valid kind of questions that had to be worked through, whether, it was the adjoining churches or, the neighborhoods that were nearby.
Right. Greenville High School.
And Greenville High School,
Right.
And that was one,
Right.
I almost forgot about that.
Yeah.
That property, the property had to be acquired from the school district. And the school district had bought the acreage for a practice field for the baseball. It was kind of, and Greenville, my daughter went to Greenville High School, so very important to the city, having that inner city high school. But probably on your main street, because remember, it was Maine at this point. Probably having a practice high school baseball field is probably not the highest and best use.
No.
And so it was really kind of, but it was working with the school. By the way, I think the trustees, when the Board of Trustees voted, it was like by one vote that they approved.
Wow.
So that was a lot of work that our former city attorney had to really work through.
Sure.
But then it was working with the neighborhoods because that required movement into the neighborhoods.
That's right.
And so it was really looking, and again, our community development did such a great job of working to really replace some of the housing that was going to have to be relocated and more. So, it's like, when people see a project, and I think that one is one that probably of so many just required so many moving parts.
Right.
So it wasn't just about, dealing with a school, dealing with neighborhoods, dealing with churches, dealing with property owners who, maybe didn't necessarily want to sell, and then making sure that you could get the private developer to do the private part of it along with a team. I mean, it was very complicated. But once that was worked out, the easy part, was seeing it happen.
Actually, yeah.
But I think that's the other part that most people, maybe they don't need to know. Maybe they don't need to know. Sometimes I think it's probably good if people think that, those things just happen.
So that always brings me to a question, and this is just a question that, I always ask myself, how long are you willing to do something before you actually see the benefit of it? And you think about it and it's like, how long are you able to go on your diet? I would just say to myself personally, before you actually start seeing your physical body change and stuff. And so it's funny also on the social economical side of things, how long are we going to be willing to, invest in the time into these people and showing them the public benefit of making this new development and change.
So it's kind of like when's the right time to cut bait and when's the right time to continue to push.
You're right.
Well, I think it depends. If it is a vision that you see that you ultimately, I think the benefits are going to be there. I think you continue for as long as it takes.
Yeah.
I mean, things don't happen. Now, the public is doesn't always have patience with things.
Right.
But I think you keep at it. As long as you can clearly articulate what's going to, that it is going to be of value, and minimize any, because there are always going to be disruptions. There are always going to be, again, unintended consequences, and you just really need to be prepared. Much like some of today, it's looking at who thought things were going to escalate. I mean, with, for instance, multifamily. We were trying to get multifamily, and then all of a sudden it exploded. And then all of a sudden, we had been so meticulous about really working with affordable housing and within our neighborhoods. And then all of a sudden, those wonderful projects that we're doing is putting pressure on the very people who we didn't want to put pressure on. And sometimes you just, but the thing is, it's never too late. I think it's an important thing too.
Yeah, Nancy, I got a question for you, and this kind of came from when you brought up talking with Frank Halter early on, and him kind of giving you support in the beginning. I was talking to a realtor of mine about this podcast, and she said. "Oh my God, that would be so good for people to listen to about Greenville and the upstate and everything." And so, my question is these public-private partnership projects greatly benefit everybody. The ultimate question is, how do you sell a city? So you think about some commercial realtors and you think about residential realtors. They are luring businesses, families here to buy a home, invest, and do all these things. You basically kind of were behind the scenes seeing the growth of, some 4 projects that we talked about that now people use as kind of part of their, one sheet poster to sell Greenville. How did you sell Greenville back in the day? And
specifically, during the we're talking about before, during the 80s and 90s
when there wasn't much to show for it.
I think what you have to articulate as best you can, what is down the road. And to that point, we were working with a developer who sent a team in to do, and this was in the 80s, I guess, and maybe even the 90s. And when the work was done, they took a pass. But the people who were doing the report sat down and said, there's nothing that we can find right now that really could justify, just really, you're just not there. Yeah. But he said, but you've created an illusion that there's a lot more going on. And he said, my advice is to keep that illusion going until we really have the legs here to support. Yeah. And I thought, so that's part of it too. You got to be honest with people. I mean, you can't sell. I mean, but whenever we would talk about, here's what we have now, but here's our plan. And we had a plan. Yeah. We had a strategy. And this is where we're going. We want to be a part of it. And I think sometimes, and I've always remembered that illusion thing. Now, it's not something you want to employ all the time, obviously. Right. But it's important that, you do have, but what you got to do is you need someone to tell you that, but also tell you, you got to work on those fundamentals. Because if you don't get that part, so those important. Are the years that
you're selling an idea.
And a little bit harder because it is kind of, to use a sports net, it's the blocking and tackling of getting all of that done. And it's not so much fun, and it's not but you got to do that to get to the good stuff. To get to the end of the, to score the touchdown.
Right.
If you're not doing good blocking and tackling and getting those fundamentals in place, you're not going to make it there.
Right.
Quite often.
That's so important.
That's how I think it was done.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Nancy, one of the things about you that I've always thought was very impressive was one of the first times I met you in my capacity, and it was at City of Greenville quarterly breakfast, and it was at your retirement, and Knox spoke, all the councilmen and women spoke, but the biggest kind of shining star in the whole entire room was you, because you're announcing 40 years of retirement. There were tears and some people sobbing and upset just because you've done so much and you're so well loved. And so after the breakfast, everyone's now kind of congregating, leaving, and everyone's kind of gathered around you, want to see you on your kind of final farewell. And there's all these people, a lot of commotion, everyone's surrounding you, and I'm kind of working my way into the crowd. And as I'm working on my way, you catch me and you grab me by the shoulder and you say, "How's your mom doing?" And this is when, Susan's still fighting cancer, but when right initially when it kind of came out that she was, and you had the ability to know that there's all these people around you that want to talk to you, but you see me and you understand who I am, my mother's story, and you're able just to catch a glimpse of me and just to make sure you reach out and touch me and say, "Hey, I'm thinking about you." And I think that's one of the most brilliant things about you. And I think that you do such a great job of knowing people in a room and making everyone feel important.
Well, that was very kind. Very kind.
Thank you.
But that is, at the end of the day,
right.
There's so much you can accomplish in life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great. But at the end of the day, it's about people.
Yeah.
And you truly, and I have a gift that I think that my parents instilled with me, is the importance of people.
Yeah.
All people.
Right.
And knowing people individually,
mm-hmm.
and appreciating where they're coming from,
God,
no matter where they
right.
are, I think is incredibly important.
Yeah.
Incredibly important.
That's amazing. Well, we're going to take another quick break, and we'll be right back. The Southbound Podcast is sponsored by Blue Water Civil Design. Blue Water Civil Design is a professional civil engineering firm located in Greenville, South Carolina, serving the southeastern United States and beyond. Started in 2010, the firm is bound together by 4 founding professional engineers with more than 100 years combined experience in all aspects of civil site work engineering, land planning, site selection, and analysis. For more information, please visit us at bluewatercivil.com.
Nancy, thank you again for taking some time to talk to us a little bit about how you became what you are today and what you've meant to Greenville, and then also to the development of Greenville over the past 40 years. Really fantastic. So with that said, everybody, we appreciate you tuning in for session number 1 with Nancy Whitworth and the making of the City of Greenville. We hope you will stick around for session number 2, where we're going to talk a little bit about the current market, the upstate, where it is now and where it's going.
Welcome to the Southbound Podcast for session number 2 with Nancy Whitworth. I'm co-hosting today with Kyle Snipes. Nancy's joining us as a former economic development director for the City of Greenville for 40 years, and now currently a economic development consultant with Spartanburg Inc, as well as the at-large member of the South Carolina Department of Transportation Board of Commissioners. Nancy, thank you so much for everything you've shared with us today. You've really kind of shed some light behind the making of Greenville, and that we appreciate that. But let's now turn our focus and attention towards what you're currently doing with Spartanburg One. How has that transition been for you in working with them and bringing your expertise and experience over there with them? How's that been?
Okay. Well, actually, it's been fun.
Yeah.
It's kind of fun. I was approached by Catherine O'Neill, who is the Chief Economic Development Officer for One Spartanburg Inc., which One Spartanburg Inc. is the chamber. It's the economic development entity for the county and tourism all into one. But Catherine had taken on, we were introduced by a mutual friend. It was really right before I retired. And she was taking over that new role, having been the county administrator for Spartanburg for a number of years. And so we were talking, and she said, well, now what are you going to be doing? And I was like, well, I don't know. And she said, well, I'd love it if you would, would work with us just in a consulting role. And mind you, it is a very limited, I am just a very limited advisor consultant. But the one thing that I love cities. And so even when I was with a city, whether it was through ULI or through some other economic development groups, I would always do a lot of work with other cities anyway. And so I love seeing what happens to a city. And so I did. I joined them. Gosh, it's been a little over a year now. Time goes by really fast. And so we are kind of my focus a good bit is more in the city areas. And interesting, the thing that is really refreshing and fun about Spartanburg is that the city and the county, the chamber, and all the other municipalities really within Spartanburg County are all aligned. So when they say One Spartanburg, it is a vision, One Spartanburg, but they're really working together. And so what I spend a lot of my time is really working on a lot of the downtown projects. And so that, for me, has been great fun. Right. And good people and great fun.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's awesome. And working with Spartanburg One, that's always been my feel. It's still a hometown feel where you are family. You come and you work in Spartanburg. We're all going to kind of help each other and support each other. And so when they rebranded about a year ago, I was like, this is so brilliant. And now they've kind of created a blueprint for other chambers and economic development groups to kind of merge as one and actually kind of influence other surrounding southern cities that are kind of taking the lead from Spartanburg.
Yeah, I think One Spartanburg Inc. is really a really unique model. There are not many in the country, but I do think things that, and I think that's what's always important. Really what works in one city might not work in another. Exactly. And I think that what Spartanburg is really looking at now is, what makes us? What makes us us? And great building stock. So. Oh yeah.
Well, if there's one thing too, when you think about Spartanburg and that urban core right there, for people who may not know, what do you think the big opportunity is in Spartanburg? Who needs to be looking at downtown Spartanburg from an investment standpoint and just from a livability standpoint?
Yeah. Well, interestingly, there are a lot of developers who have done projects in Greenville that are doing projects in Spartanburg now. Yeah. So I think it is in some ways it's a new frontier for others to come. There are some great developers who are there, who are working on things there. And so, but it's kind of bringing in and meshing those different, because a developer coming in perhaps from out of town, much like it happened in Greenville, they see things that, locally we don't always see. Right. And so it's having that fresh approach. I think Spartanburg has, I love the buildings. I love buildings. Yeah. They've got great buildings, but they have a fantastic trail system that, and I know we didn't talk about the Swamp Rabbit Trail and what a huge asset that has been for Greenville. But as Spartanburg is working on their trail system, in fact, when I was meeting with the city manager in Catherine one day, and we were showing all that was going on, I was like, you got to put the trail, and they talked about it. I was like, put those trails in there, and when you see it, and they have the ability to really connect two rivers, the Tiger River to the Pacolet, all converging and traversing through downtown and beyond. It really is, and I think that is sort of opens up Spartanburg for an identity of outdoors. And whether it was the pandemic, I think we were going in that direction anyway.
Sure. Yeah.
And it really demonstrates that importance of outdoors. And, whether you use, now, admittedly, I don't use the Swamp Rabbit Trail, but knowing it's there is so important. And it's important for business. It's really important for locations, too.
There are so many people that come in from out of town. They stay at a downtown hotel and they say, well, I got a nice place to run in the morning and run on the Swamp Rabbit Trail. And it's running right by a river. And so you think about for Spartanburg too, as well, it's like, where can you go? And when it's kind of clear and it's easy to navigate, it's like, well, I'll come back and do more business trips here.
That's right.
Yeah. So it really, all of those things work together. And I think the importance is really making a place first and foremost for the people who live there. And then you kind of work on beyond that.
Right.
So if it's good for people to live there, then you're going to want to have investments from obviously from the business side. Spartanburg is, it is amazing in terms of advanced manufacturing.
Sure.
And, we're talking high end. It is unbelievable, the amount of activity. And I think that's one thing, again, I have been removed from, and purposely so, from the city of Greenville.
Sure.
But it has been amazing to me, the amount of activity that is going on in Spartanburg in the midst of a pandemic.
Right.
There was that first, I know the chamber, the One Spartanburg Inc. Assembled a Bringing Back the Burg task force. That included the county and the city and the private sector and all of the different entities to really begin to really track what are those key metrics. So so we can see sort of real time how are we doing. And interestingly, it has been quite refreshing to see how quickly, and I think you kind of intuitively know things are getting better, but when you can actually see the data, it really makes all the difference in the world.
I think that brings up a great point too, just from a data standpoint, but then just from an initiative standpoint. We think about Spartanburg and everything that they're doing well. Are there a few key initiatives that you see that you really like that Spartanburg's doing correctly that's helping them grow, whether they are?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that they're doing. I don't know that I would single out, but I do think this collaborative approach. And when I'm talking collaborative, I mean, both local governments, both the county and the city. And again, I don't want to leave out the other, municipalities in Spartanburg too, like Woodruff. I mean, you could write you could write a story on each one of these. But I do think is now really focused. They're investing back in themselves.
That's right.
They're doing a lot in that world. I think there's very much a focus on not just attracting, which is important, but it's also looking at, all right, how can we stabilize, how can we grow our own, and really looking at their downtown. It is so cool. There's so many neat restaurants, but if you're looking at it from my eyes, I look at that, but then I also look at, but look at all these buildings. Look at this great potential. And so having an understanding that there is potential there.
And that's one thing you think about with Greenville. It's not at capacity, but Greenville's kind of at its bubble per se. Spartanburg, it hasn't yet touched the edges of downtown. Like it's got some big bones behind it, and so you could see a couple maybe high-rise buildings. I don't know. A couple of big projects occurring downtown.
Yeah, I think, there are a lot, multifamily.
Yeah.
I remember in Greenville when we were just, trying to get multifamily. And then, toward the end when I left, I know we would another one. Don't tell me there's another multifamily. So in Spartanburg, that is really beginning to happen. But they're also on the front end, so that they are really taking care of the affordability aspect.
That's right.
So if you're going to get an incentive for, you're going to have to ensure that you're doing, and it's affordability, not just how you're pricing the unit, but affordability for the people who live there. And so it has to be income qualified. So it's really taking some things and looking at how can we ensure that we get what we need, but we minimize and mitigate some of the unintended consequences of that growth.
Yeah. Well, to piggyback on just that entire conversation, where Spartanburg is right now and kind of the development process, you think about Greenville's doing some amazing things. Spartanburg is doing some great things. The city of Anderson is really doing some fantastic things as well. Just based on the life cycle of things, it seems like Spartanburg, as you mentioned, they're kind of on the front end of that multifamily conversation. When you look at that transition from Greenville to Spartanburg, is there anything else kind of like that you see as, hey, here's some good things that Spartanburg can leverage from your experience in Greenville, and here's some things maybe we want to do a little bit differently?
Yeah. Well, I think to me, everything is about balance.
Yeah.
And so sometimes, as I said, you have to be careful about what you wish for, and be prepared.
Right.
I think that, again, being attuned to making sure you want a place to be desirable, but at the same time, you want it to be accessible to.
Right.
And so I think with, Greenville has almost taken on a life of its own. Whereas Spartanburg has the ability, I think, to, and understand, people talk about a lot about competition between, really from an economic development standpoint. And I will tell you, from an economic developer working within the upstate, we never saw it that way.
Right.
It was always, what can we do? Because then I have always felt, so goes Anderson, so goes Greenville.
That's right.
So goes Spartanburg. We're all in it together.
That's right.
And we are too small. This state is too small for us to be, competing. So it's how we can work together. And so very, very often there are conversations, between the economic developers of each one of these, trying to figure out how can we support each other.
That's fantastic.
So now in a political world, that doesn't always, that's different. I mean, but that's okay.
Well, everyone wants to, tout themselves and show themselves off. I think Greenville gets a little bit more kind of like publications as of recently, but Spartanburg right now, I mean, if you're a business and you're looking to relocate, I mean, as far as dealing with the local municipalities, from my understanding, Spartanburg tends to be easier to just transition to.
Well, it's a very welcoming. It's a very business oriented, and not to minimize. And they have some great initiatives like the North Side, which is a model for a purpose-built community of. So again, they're making those investments that sometimes takes a little bit longer. Much like nothing happens overnight. When somebody says that, that's generally not true. And so they're really well positioned. And I think that looking at really the Spartanburg and Greenville and Anderson and really Pickens County. I mean, it all kind of grows together.
That's right.
And I would predict that in the future that the west side of Greenville and the east side of Greenville and the west side of Spartanburg are gonna
merge together and be the.
And who cares? Nobody really. You and I'm on 85 some, so people are going back and forth. They don't really. They're not distinguishing between. Well, I am here.
That's right.
And then you look at, the Greenville's sort of west side moving into Easley, and it's just, and then southern moving into Anderson. Right. It's all one market.
And you have BMW right there in the middle, BMW and Michelin right there in the middle, and you have all their subsidiaries that are kind of sprawling out as well.
And BMW was huge for Spartanburg County.
Oh,
huge.
Yeah.
And then you look at Greer. I mean, oh my goodness.
It's a beautiful.
So, but I think that the more that, we will always have home, but I think the more that we look at this, we kind of talk about, you look at Dallas, Fort Worth, now they're huge, but you look at Raleigh, Durham, Greenville, Spartanburg. It can be, and it's really identifying, what works.
Right.
And no one, you take ideas from other communities, but you don't try to duplicate them or replicate them. I just remember, actually, it was Bob Hughes, who prolific developer, obviously, in Greenville. All up and down Main Street, having worked on projects. One of the things I know that came up at one point was, we need to figure out how to get more people, tourists here. And it was always these ideas, we got to do this, and we got to do that. And I remember Bob saying, but you do that, somebody else can do that better. So whether it's an aquarium, whatever it is, you have to do something that nobody else. Right. So just be yourself.
That's right.
And you don't have to always have an attraction.
That's a good point.
Your attraction can be just that feeling that you have being in a place where you have some nice restaurants. You've got outdoor space. You've got some, but it doesn't always have to be a major attraction.
That's right.
To make things happen.
Yeah. Well, speaking to that exactly too, placemaking has been a buzzword for a number of years now, but creating that feeling that you're kind of describing, how important is that in your experience in Greenville and Spartanburg as you see other municipalities as far as to help really create that next step of growth?
Okay. It is important. Yeah. But, it's something I've said, and I think it was in Walt Disney, I think it's where it is your feet will take you where your eyes want to go. So what you need to make sure is that whatever you have, you connect it. And it's a pleasant experience. And you don't always worry so much about, you figure out how to spend your dime. And it's not always, in what you're walking on. So sometimes we get really, it's got to be brick. Well, no, it really probably doesn't need to be brick because you'll trip on it, half the time. It's really focused on those things that carry your eyes. And you can have all of these wonderful things going on, but if you don't connect them and you don't create that experience. So I think that's part of the placemaking. And I think, again, you don't have to have, it can just be wonderful plazas where people can just hang out. People love to just hang out. And you think about Greenville. Now, people do come, but half the time they're just coming just to walk.
That's right.
To see people. And you create those venues for people to enjoy that. And, someone once told me, we were talking about, there was the public-private, the investment that the city of Greenville did in public spaces, and, helped spur private development. Because a space without something surrounding it, and that's the other thing, we think sometimes we just got to create a space. But think about it. If you don't have something defining it,
that's right.
It's also about placemaking. So there's something, whether they're restaurants or people living or whatever, you've got to. And this person once said, well, downtown Greenville is where everyone can come to enjoy the wealth of others. And what I meant by that was, there are public spaces. and there's private development, but it works together because but for that private development, you might not have those wonderful spaces. So it all works together.
That's good.
As long as you make it all public.
So Nancy, I have a question to ask you about, you just elected to the at-large position on the Board of Commissioners for the South Carolina Department of Transportation. I know that there's been up in Washington, the infrastructure bill and stuff. But what about South Carolina infrastructure and what we are focused on? We have the inlet port and Greer that I've heard that now Georgia's going to kind of replicate or kind of do something similar to. What are you seeing as far as statewide that we're looking at for the infrastructure, and any maybe some big teasers or anything big coming up that we would be impacted by?
Well, I don't think there are any big teasers because I will tell you that the Department of Transportation for the state, it's led by Secretary Hall, who is just amazing. She's just an amazing person. But it is very transparent. And it wasn't always that way, from my understanding. I am the newbie, of course. I am the newbie commissioner. But really understanding the General Assembly was very gracious a number of years ago. And finally, we got a gas tax. We're still lower. We're still lower than our surrounding states. It's in the fourth year, getting ready to go in the fifth year of a 6-year, 2-cent year hike. But most people don't realize that the Transportation Department for the state of South Carolina, we're the fourth largest in the country in terms of road miles under control.
Wow.
That's a lot.
That is a lot. And it's such a small state.
We're not that big of a state. There are a lot of roads that probably shouldn't be state roads, but then we have a very robust interstate system as well. And so when the General Assembly provided that increase, there was a plan put in place, and it's very transparent. So you can go on the website and you can see where every dollar is going. And so there was a focus on interstates. There was a focus on repaving. There was a focus on some of our rural roads because those are, and bridges.
Yeah.
And so it has been a very deliberate, let's get our road system.
Right.
It was neglected for probably 30 years. So it's a huge undertaking. Yeah. But the good thing is progress is being made.
That's right. I-20, I-26 is kind of the next big interstate project that's going to go underway. You have the Gateway project here in the upstate that was kind of huge and impactful. 85 still under construction.
85 is under construction, 26. There's a lot going on. I will tell you the Gateway project in the upstate was that was tackled first, primarily just to, make sure, get it kind of under the belt, because the really big one is the Carolina Crossroads, which is the I-20, I-26, and then you got about 5 other roads coming in there. It's huge. It's huge. But it's having, I think, having a strategic now planned that allows the ability to move forward some of these, because our interstate system is critical. Right. It's critical, to our way of life in the state.
That's right.
Yeah. And so, but it's been interesting. Again, that was something that never really crossed my mind until I got the call about, would you be interested? And again, it's a lot to learn. There are more acronyms than one can possibly ever keep straight. But it's so important to economic development. So it really is quite a good alignment.
Well, if I could say, asking a question about that specifically. So a lot of the folks who may be listening to this podcast are maybe in the architecture, engineering, development, construction industries,
real estate,
municipalities and real estate. From SCDOT perspective, anything that you want to say to them that they need to be aware of regarding just the future of development working with SCDOT?
Okay. Well, and I think this is one of the things that we've kind of talked about is it is really keeping both from the DOT standpoint, from our districts, and it really is, the district offices throughout the state of DOT, with the developers, with the local,
Right.
our local entities, municipalities,
Right.
counties, making sure that they're all aligned and having those discussions on the front end. So there's some things that we're looking at that we need to just sort of look at is that if you're a developer and, sometimes a project requires an improvement to be made.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's an improvement that once that developer makes it, everybody else benefits from. Or conversely, everybody comes along and then it's that last person in, and then that triggers, and it not necessarily what that person did, but it's everything above. So those are hard ones. But, those are some of the kind of conversations. But the more that I think that we can have these really alignments with our local and really start thinking about planning, because I don't anticipate in this state that we're not going to have and continue to have growth. I think the upstate, and we all know that you can't widen your way out of traffic.
Yeah.
So it's really looking at how can we do things differently? How can we do things better? And
that's right. Well, I'm glad that you're on that board position. And Nancy, I just want to say, go ahead.
No, and I was just going to say, just staying in that vein and actually, let me pause for just a minute too. Serge, how are we doing on time? Do we have to cut right at 1 o'clock?
Well, not necessarily, but Les Nancy's got to go. I know we haven't set till 1.
Okay.
So I was going to wrap it up.
How are you doing on time?
I'm okay.
Okay.
But I don't want to.
Yeah.
I don't want
If you want to do one more question.
Extend my visit either.
I'll tell you what. I'll say this.
I've already done that one time.
Harper will cover the overrun if that's okay.
Oh yeah.
So, Serge, we'll put it on Harper's bill if that's okay, man. All right. But no, I think just
tell David it was my fault.
no, just blame it on me.
Tell David I talk too much.
That's all right. No, we'll put it on Kyle. Well, so
I mean that last little piece that you talked about.
That's it, because I feel like you're going out of that last question. I'd love to ask is you're talking about what growth is going to look like in the upstate. So being able to go down the path of what does growth look like? What are kind of opportunities that you see for the upstate? But then also too, what are some things that you're paying attention to that, hey, you know what? We need to get this right so we don't mess it up.
We need to take care of it.
Right. What opportunities and threats, sort of.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Sure.
All right. So, Serge, can you count us down or however you want to get us started again?
5, 4, 3, 2.
All right. So, Nancy, I feel like that brings us to another great just conversation or question that we'd love to ask you is, so growth in the upstate. We're seeing the trend data as far as the population moving to the south. The 85 corridor continues to be projected to grow pretty rapidly over the next 10 years. So just in your mind, when you think about, and your knowledge of the upstate, what opportunities are out there that you're really excited about? And then I'd love to ask follow-up questions about kind of what maybe are some things you're concerned about, maybe threats out there.
Okay. Well, as I said, I think the growth for the upstate, it's hard. I think the tough thing is once the genie is out of the bottle, it's hard to put it back in.
That's right.
And so I think we are seeing some pressure points. I think we're seeing, and it's tough. It really is tough. And I don't, not getting into any kind of discussions, political discussions or anything like that. But, you have landowners who really want to sell. And then you have concerns about what impact is that going to have.
That's right.
And so really carefully having, I think, plans, I think are important because you've got to be able to articulate to people. You need for people to know what to expect. Right. Now, if I could wave a magic wand, there are parts of the upstate that are not experiencing the growth. and not that you want to, change. And I will give where I grew up, Abbeville County, perfect example. It was textiles, it was farming, none of that, and consequently, there are no jobs there, or very few jobs. So, and yet what you have in Greenville, you have in Spartanburg, is trying to figure out, we have companies trying to figure out how can we get more people.
Right.
So if I could wave a magic wand, it would be, how can we get some of this where they really need it?
That's right.
But I know that's, that's kind of Pollyanna, and probably not. But I think it's going to take some of that. It's like at some point, it's going to have to be, how can we, and whether or not it is even trying to look at whether it's transportation, whether it's a way to get people so that they can enjoy, because people like choices. I think that's important in housing. People, an urban center is not for everybody. But if you choose a rural setting, I know people who commute an hour, and that's a lot.
Right.
And so how can we get more people to live where they want to live, where we have the capacity to have them, and get them to jobs where they are. And that's the hard part, is how to manage that. And I think that's where more of a regional approach to trying to figure out, but that's hard to do. That's really hard to do.
So that brings me to a great question about ready workforce. When, we're trying to lure a business to the upstate, to South Carolina. South Carolinians are known as, hunters, backwoods, rednecks, this, that, the other. But, at the same time, we also want to be known as hardworking and, being able to supply labor for, a big manufacturing company that would transplant here, like Boeing coming to North Charleston, was very impactful up and down the state. And then you had Volvo coming as well. How much is that ready workforce important for us to continue to push in the technical colleges, the community colleges, to kind of have, the kids in their 20s and all that ready to kind of enter into the workforce? How important is that?
Well, it's incredibly important. And, that is one thing I do think the state does really well. They've always, through their, and I know we've been working in Spartanburg directly with Spartanburg Community College. And, their new chancellor, it's so visionary about how do we look at, making sure that that our workforce, our potential workforce. So you got to start. A lot of cases, you got to start before somebody's really ready to get a job. You got to kind of get them moving in that direction before. So looking at innovative ways to really, within the schools, within our school systems. I think we're all searching for, we all want higher per capita, and that is important. But at the same time, not everybody in higher educational rates, at the baccalaureate or graduate, but not everybody really needs that anymore. And I think that is going to be something that we, it was always expected you've got to go to college. Maybe not necessarily so. Not necessarily so. And I think that's got to be some kind of mindset that we've really got to work with. That you don't always, that's not always the path for everyone.
That's right.
And do more in that regard.
Yeah.
The apprenticeships.
Nancy, I just want to say thank you so much for being on Southbound today. You have a brilliant mind. You're a beautiful person, and we thank you for your time. We also want to just give thanks real quick to our production manager, Sergio. He's doing a fantastic job getting us mic'd up and ready. And Dawn King as well. Thank you, Dawn. Peyton Howe couldn't be with us today, and we just thank all of our listeners as well. So please continue to follow us, spread the word about Southbound. Kyle, you want to take us out?
Yeah, hey, so thank you very much, and we look forward to catching you next time on Southbound.
Thanks.